Here we are talking about Eikha in advance of Tisha B'Av. And of course, Eikha's other name is the Sefer Kinot, the Book of Lamentations or laments, lament poems. And when I sort of envisage in my mind a lament, I think of somebody sitting alone maybe Yirmiyahu HaNavi sitting alone in the ruins of Yerushalayim, very absorbed in his own grief. Me'ai chamar maru, this notion that my stomach is churning and turning over, and we might imagine that Eikha is a lot talking about ourselves, is talking about the state of the Jewish people, inward looking, maybe not upward looking towards God. But in fact, Eikha has a tremendous amount of theology. It's not just about us, but it's about what God is doing to us and how we should turn to God. So maybe Dr. Ziegler, share with us a little bit about the theology of Eikha. What does Eikha have to say about the relationship between Hashem and Am Yisrael?
Well, first of all, I think you're right that there's a lot of lamentation, mourning here that is not theology, right? This is not the book of Eov. This is not a systematic attempt to try to understand God's role. But you're also right that there is something systematic, I think, that's going on underlying this. And that is, of course, that there is a sense of we are questioning what is God's role in these events and what is our relationship with God as a result of these events. When I look at Eikha, I think of Eikha as a chiastic structure, right? Which is where we have A, B, C, B, A, right? It's 5 chapters. And I think that chapter 1 and chapter 5 are very similar chapters. They're similar linguistically. They're similar in terms of their tone. They're very similar in terms of some of the topics that they bring up, right? These are, for example, the only 2 chapters that have the word almana, which is, and both of them are Ki almana, which is interesting. That's just one example. But more importantly, they're very similar in terms of their theology, right? And they kind of wind their way towards a conclusion of tziduk hadin, right? That God is just, that we may not always understand the world around us, but tzadiku Hashem, kifihu mariti, right? God is just because I rebelled against him.
I sinned, I deserve it.
Yeah. Oyna lanu ki chatanu. It takes a while to get there. Both in Perek Aleph and in Perek Hey, there's kind of a movement towards this confession, right? This vidui. But eventually they get there. And that, I like to say, that's kind of the periphery of the book. It's the buffer, right? It puts the book within the context of emuna pshuta, right? Simple faith in God. What we see in chapters 2 and 4, I think it's fascinating. It's completely different. It's completely different. God in chapter 2 is portrayed 3 times as an enemy. Now this may seem...
And he's furious.
He's furious.
Very angry.
Yeah. And there's an accusation that is kind of, lobbed at God. Haragta biyom apecha, tavalta, tavachta, velo chamalta, right? You slaughtered, God. You slaughtered. And the image there of the children that are dying on the streets, it's an image of tzaddik varalo, right? Innocent people who bad things happen to them. It never really reconciles.
Re'ei Hashem v'abita lemi olalta ko.
That's right.
What did you do?
Right. It's accusatory in nature. I mean, Perek Dalet is a little bit more muted in this sense than Perek Bet, but also in Perek Dalet, the image of the children dying on the streets, tossed out on every street corner. It's really difficult. It's difficult to read. These chapters 2 and 4 are difficult to read, both in terms of their tone, their content, the ra'av, the starvation in the city. We mentioned previously the mothers who are consuming their children, right? But ultimately, I think what's most difficult about these chapters is that they never really reconcile with God. The image of God as an enemy, and by the way, this is a very unique image in the Tanakh. It doesn't appear at Eov. Right? God is an enemy, right? Haya Hashem ke'oyev, bila Yisrael.
So how do you deal with that? I mean, in other words, it almost sounds on the verge of heretical.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, it does. And, as someone who grew up in a Beis Yaakov world where we were told, Gam zu l'tova, right? Everything that God does is for the best, is good, right? You know, so these psukim, these prakim, these chapters, they don't seem to reconcile themselves to God. By the way, I will just say, because I left it open, that there is one other place in Tanakh where God is described as an enemy of Am Yisrael, and that's in Yeshayahu, so I'm just leaving that to the side. How do we reconcile ourselves to this? Well, I think that what Eikha is doing is it's creating a very balanced approach to how the religious person copes with suffering within a theological context. Because I think that it is this balance. On the one hand, we look around, we see a world that is a very troubling world around us. Children do die, innocent people do suffer. We do have pandemics that sweep through the world. We do have natural catastrophes. We do have the building in Surfside in Miami that came crashing down. And it's hard as a religious person to reconcile ourselves to that, to understand what was God's plan. You know, is it so simple to say, you know, I sinned and therefore? Clearly it's not, right? That formula isn't one that always seems so simple. So on the one hand, what Eikha tells us is I can't live in a world where I don't believe in God's justness. That world is an absurd world. Ultimately, that idea kind of surrounds us, right? It surrounds our kind of pure, simple faith. Emuna pshuta, tzadiku Hashem kifiu mariti. On the other hand, we look at a world, we look at the realistic world around us, and it's not so simple to resort to these kind of very simple formula. And therefore, we're always holding these two in balance.
You know, we've just been learning in Daf Yomi, we've been learning Masechet Yuma. And just a few weeks ago, we learned an amazing Gemara about this. That Moshe Rabbeinu says, Ha'el, Ha'gadol, Ha'gibor, V'Hanora. And that the people who experienced the Churban, like Yirmiyahu, simply couldn't say those words. They couldn't call Hashem Gadol Unora anymore. Because, and then the Gemara says, how couldn't they say that? They said, Mitoch sheyodim she'amitihu. Sometimes when you have faith in God, you have to be honest. And the idea that you know Hashem is the God of Emet means that when you're experiencing the raw brunt of tragedy, you have to call it out for what it is and say, I feel like Hashem, you are pummeling me, right? You're killing us.
Yeah.
And ironically, that's an act of faith. That's an act of faith. Instead of sort of like plastering it over and making it look pretty and, as you say, gamzu l'tova, the real act of faith is to say, I know what's happening and Hashem's there.
Yeah, but I mean, we can't obviously though conclude without talking about Perek Gimel, which is the central focus, it's the central axis of Megillat Eikha. There we have the Gever. The Gever, as you said, starts out very self-absorbed. He's very self-absorbed in his own suffering. The first word of Perek Gimel is Ani. Ani hagever ra'a oni. He never mentions God by name until Pasuk Yud-Chet. But what happens at the center of Perek Gimel, and if you think about it, it's the center of the center, right? It's the central Perek, the center of the center is theology. It is the only section in the book of Eikha which has some kind of developed theology, a description of God, and the conclusion of the Gever is, God is filled with rachamim, with chesed, right? Kilo chalu rachamecha, right? Kilo chastei Hashem kilo tamnu, kilo chalu rachamav, right? There's a sense, I think, that Megillat Eikha at its center is mirroring the center of the human being, right? Human beings are kind of surrounded by this storm, right? This storm of a world that doesn't always make sense. But when we kind of tunnel through to the center of the human, what we find there is the ability to find God and to find God's goodness. And the word that kind of surprisingly appears right at the center of Eikha 3 times in a row, because there we have a triple acrostic, is that the pasuk opens with the word tov. Tov, tov, tov la gever ki yisa ol b'ne'urav. It's a really surprising word to find in the middle of Eikha. And the final word of Perek Gimel, right? Perek Gimel opens with the word ani, but it closes with the word Hashem, right? And so Perek Gimel, this Gever, he finds God through his suffering. He starts out deeply absorbed in his own kind of, he's confused, he's disoriented, and he digs deep inside and he finds God. And it's pretty remarkable, I think.
Thank you.